Her life was worth a few $100s. Her child's even less. She was a pregnant Indigenous girl, caught in the gears of a cold transaction, a piece of property to be moved and sold. But one man, a dying rancher whose own life had been whittled down to its last dollar and its last breath, saw something else entirely. He saw a debt that the world owed, and he was about to pay it. Before we get into this tale, let us know in the comments, where are you watching from, and subscribe if you want more content like this one. The dust was a living thing. It was in Elias's lungs, a fine grit that grated with every shallow breath he took, a constant reminder of the decay that had taken root inside him. It coated the dashboard of his truck, a pale shroud over the cracked vinyl. It settled on the land, his land, turning the once fertile soil into a gray, barren expanse that mirrored the wasteland of his own future. The doctors had used words like palliative and time, but Elias understood the simpler language of the earth. The ranch was dying, and so was he. Each sunrise was an act of stubborn defiance, a brief flare of light against an encroaching permanent dark. He had once been a man of substance, his hands thick with purpose, his heart full of a love for his wife, Martha, and a future that had seemed as wide and endless as the Montana sky. Now, his hands were thin, papery things, and the sky felt like a lid on a coffin. He was a ghost haunting the ruins of his own life, every fence post a memory, every creak of the porch a phantom footstep of the woman he had lost. The regret was the sharpest pain of all, a more persistent ache than the cancer that was methodically colonizing his bones. He had made promises to Martha he couldn't keep, not about money or success, but about being present, about being a softer man than the hard world had made him. He had failed. Now, all he had was the final grim task of managing his own obsolescence. He'd sold off most of the herd, the machinery, piece by piece, until all that was left was the house, the dust, and a small stack of bills in a coffee can, enough for a clean exit, enough to not be a burden found by strangers. It was in the town's only diner, a place that smelled of stale coffee and fried regret, that the world intruded on his carefully curated solitude. Two men sat in the booth behind him, their voices low and slick with a casual cruelty that made the hairs on Elias's arms stand up. They weren't talking about cattle or land. They were talking about a girl. "She's ripe," one said, the word a profanity. "Won't be for long. The buyer from the city gets squeamish if they're too far along." Elias didn't turn. He just sat there, his coffee growing cold, the words snagging in his mind. They spoke of logistics, of a meeting point at the old county line, of a price that made his stomach turn. It was a business transaction, cold and efficient, the same way a man might discuss selling a used truck. He felt a tremor in his hand, a resurgence of an old, useless anger. He was a spectator to the world's casual evils, a dying man listening to the machinations of predators. He paid for his coffee and walked out, the bell over the door chiming a hollow, mocking farewell. Conversation followed him, clinging to him like the dust, another layer of grit in a life that had become defined by it. He saw her the next day, a ghost made of flesh and fear, standing beside a mud-splattered pickup at the gas station on the edge of town. It was the same two men from the diner, their faces etched with impatience and a mean sort of boredom. And, between them, the girl. She couldn't have been more than 17. Her pregnancy, a gentle, defiant curve beneath a worn t-shirt. Her face was a beautiful, stoic mask, her dark eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the cracked asphalt and the shimmering heat rising from the road. But Elias, a connoisseur of quiet desperation, saw past the mask. He saw the flicker of terror, the subtle tension in her jaw, the way her hands were balled into fists at her sides. She was a captive, not in chains, but in a cage of circumstance far more difficult to escape. He watched from his own truck as one of the men bought her a bottle of water, the gesture not one of kindness, but of maintaining livestock. The girl, Lena, he didn't know her name then, but he would, took it without a word, her movements economical and wary. She was a creature of survival, her entire being coiled like a spring, ready for a blow that could come from any direction. Elias felt that familiar, bitter ache of powerlessness rise in his throat. He was no hero. He was a man who had failed to save his own wife from the slow, creeping disease that had stolen her away. A man who had watched his own world crumble into dust without raising a hand to stop it. What could he possibly do for this girl? The men were archetypes of a sickness he knew well, their smug superiority a reflection of a world that saw people like her as disposable, invisible. They were the kind of men who saw land not for its beauty, but for what could be torn from it, who saw women not as people, but as commodities. They were the world that had beaten him, the world he was preparing to leave. He saw the younger man grip her arm, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Stay put," he'd muttered, the words barely audible but carrying the clear threat of violence. The girl didn't flinch. She just stared ahead, her resilience a silent, powerful scream that only Elias seemed to hear. He put his truck in gear, his hands shaking slightly on the wheel. He should just drive away, drive back to his quiet, dying ranch, and wait for the end. It was not his fight. It was not his world anymore. But as he pulled away, her eyes met his in the rearview mirror for a fraction of a second, and in them he saw not a plea for help, but a reflection of his own profound, suffocating solitude. The image was burned into his mind, a brand on his conscience. He drove, but he wasn't escaping. He was just taking the problem with him. The silence of his house was different that night. It was no longer a peaceful shroud, but a heavy, accusatory presence. Every tick of the grandfather clock in the hall sounded like a countdown, each second a judgment on his inaction. He sat at the kitchen table, the coffee can open before him, its contents spilled out in a messy pile of worn bills and tarnished coins. This was his legacy. Not a child, not a thriving ranch, but this small, pathetic dragon's hoard of escape money. It was meant to ensure he wouldn't die in a sterile hospital room, tangled in tubes, a burden to a state that didn't know his name. It was the price of his dignity, his final selfish act of control in a life that had spun completely out of it. He tried to reason with himself, his thoughts a frantic circular argument. He was a sick man. He was weak. Intervening would be suicide, a messy and pointless one. Those men were dangerous, not just because they were strong, but because they were empty. They operated in a moral vacuum he could no longer navigate. He had nothing to offer the girl but a place to watch him die. What kind of rescue was that? He closed his eyes, and Martha's face appeared in the darkness behind his lids. It was a memory from long ago, before the sickness, before the bitterness had carved new lines around his eyes. They were standing on the porch, watching a summer storm roll in. A fawn, separated from its mother, had stumbled into their yard, terrified by the thunder. Martha, without a word, had walked out into the rain, her voice a low, soothing murmur, and gently guided the creature back toward the safety of the woods. "Everything deserves a chance to find its way home, Elias," she had told him later, her hand on his. He had forgotten that man, the one who had loved her gentleness, who had believed in the simple truth of her words. He had been buried under years of grief and failure. The memory was a key, unlocking a part of his heart he thought had seized up from rust and disuse. He looked at the money on the table. It wasn't just currency anymore. It was a choice. It was the cost of a quiet, lonely death versus the unknown price of a single, meaningful act. It was his last dollar, his last breath, his last chance to be the man Martha had believed him to be. The irony was a bitter pill. In preparing for his own end, he had stumbled upon a reason to fight for a beginning. He slowly, deliberately began to stack the bills. The decision settled over him, not with the triumphant fire of a hero, but with the grim, quiet resolve of a man walking to his own execution. He had no plan. He had no weapon. He had only this pathetic pile of money and a sudden, terrifying, and undeniable sense of purpose. He would not let that girl's life be sold for pocket change at a dusty crossroads, not while he still had a breath to spend. The drive to the county line was a journey through a dying landscape. Skeletal trees clawed at the pale evening sky, and the road was a crumbling ribbon of asphalt disappearing into the gloom. Elias's truck, his faithful companion in decay, rattled and groaned, its engine a chorus of complaint against the strain. He felt a strange calm settle over him, the kind that comes when all other options have been exhausted. This was it, the final act of a poorly written play. He gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles white, the worn leather a familiar comfort against his palms. He could see the meeting spot from a half-mile away, a single pair of headlights cutting a lonely swathe through the darkness at a desolate, unmarked intersection of two dirt roads. It was a place for secrets and sordid deals, a non-place forgotten by maps and memory. He pulled his truck to a stop 100 yards away, cutting his own lights, and watched. The buyer's car was sleek and black, a city predator far from its usual hunting grounds. The two men from the diner stood beside it, their posture a mix of deference and menace, and the girl, Lena, stood slightly apart, a silhouette of quiet defiance against the glare of the headlights. She was the still point in the center of the sordid little universe they had created. Elias took a deep breath, the air thin and cold. He got out of his truck, the door groaning in protest, and began to walk. The crunch of his boots on the gravel was impossibly loud in the immense silence. All four of them turned as he approached, his frail figure emerging from the darkness. He felt their eyes on him, sizing him up, dismissing him. He was an interruption, an anomaly. "Can we help you, old man?" the younger of the two locals asked, his voice dripping with condescension. "You lost?" The buyer, a man in a tailored suit that looked absurdly out of place, remained silent, his expression one of annoyed impatience. Elias didn't answer immediately. He let the silence stretch, his gaze fixed not on them, but on the girl. He saw the flicker of recognition in her eyes, a spark of confusion in the sea of fear. He stopped a few feet away from them, close enough to smell the cheap cologne on one man and the nervous sweat on the other. "I hear you're in business," Elias said, his voice raspy but steady. The men exchanged a look, a mixture of amusement and suspicion. "You hear a lot of things, Grandpa," the older one grunted. Elias ignored him. He reached into his coat pocket and pulled out the wad of cash, the sum of his life's final chapter. He didn't say a word. He just held it out. "I'm a buyer." The air crackled with a new kind of tension. The amusement vanished from their faces, replaced by a raw, naked greed. They looked at the money, then at him, then back at the money. They couldn't understand it. This broken-down old man appearing out of nowhere in the middle of a desolate wasteland, holding a fistful of cash. The buyer in the suit finally spoke, his voice smooth and cold. "This is a private arrangement." "Not anymore," Elias said, his voice flat. He tossed the money onto the hood of the sleek black car. It landed with a soft, obscene thud. "That's my offer. Take it or leave it." The money sat on the hood of the car, a crumpled testament to a lifetime of hard labor and regret. It looked small and insignificant under the vast, star-dusted sky, yet it held the weight of a human soul. The men stared at it, their minds working, calculating. The suited buyer was the first to break the tableau. He gave a short, dismissive laugh, a sound like ice cracking. "You're insane," he said, not to Elias, but to the two locals. "Get him out of here." But the locals weren't listening. Their eyes were glued to the cash. It was more than they had been promised. It was immediate. It was tangible. Greed, Elias knew, was a far more powerful motivator than loyalty. The older of the two, the one with the mean, narrow eyes, took a step forward. "Now, hold on," he said to the buyer. "Let's hear the man." The transaction was shifting, the power dynamics realigning in real time. Elias wasn't a hero swooping in for a rescue. He was a participant in the auction, a bidder in a marketplace of human flesh. He felt a wave of self-loathing wash over him. To save her, he had to engage in the very act of commodification he despised. He was using the world's ugly currency to fight its ugliness, and it left a foul taste in his mouth. He was not liberating her. He was purchasing her. The suited buyer, seeing he was losing control, scoffed in disgust. "Fine, keep your savage. This is more trouble than it's worth." He got back into his car without another word, the engine purring to life, and drove away, leaving a cloud of dust and indignation in his wake. Now it was just Elias, the two men, and the girl. The atmosphere grew thick with a new kind of menace. The men now saw Elias not as a threat, but as a mark, an old sick fool who had just shown his hand. The younger one grinned, a predator's smile. "All right, old man. The price just went up." Elias didn't flinch. He just stood his ground, his body aching, his resolve a thin, brittle shield. "That's all there is," he said, his voice betraying none of the exhaustion he felt. "Take it and go." For a long moment, nobody moved. The men were weighing their options. They could take the money and leave. Or they could take the money and the girl and leave the old man in a ditch. Elias saw the calculation in their eyes. He had nothing left to bargain with except the unsettling stillness of a man who had already accepted his own death. He looked past them, at Lena. Her expression was unreadable, a mask of stone. She wasn't looking at him with gratitude. She was looking at him with the same profound suspicion she had shown her other captors. In her eyes, he was just another link in the chain. The older man finally made a decision. He snatched the money from the hood of the car, stuffing it into his pocket without counting it. "Get in his truck," he barked at the girl. He shoved her forward, a rough, dismissive gesture. She stumbled but caught herself, her dignity a silent rebuke. She walked towards Elias's truck, her back straight, her head held high. The men got into their own pickup and sped off in the opposite direction, their taillights shrinking into red pinpricks before vanishing completely. And then, there was only silence. A profound, oppressive silence filled with the unspoken questions and the vast, empty darkness. Elias and Lena were alone, two strangers bound by a sordid transaction under an indifferent, watchful sky. The journey back to the ranch was a long, suffocating exercise in silence. The cab of the truck, usually a space of solitary comfort for Elias, now felt charged with an unbearable tension, a space too small for the two immense solitudes it contained. He could feel the girl's presence beside him, a palpable weight of fear, distrust, and fierce, guarded survival. She sat pressed against the passenger door, as far from him as she could get, her hands clasped tightly in her lap over the swell of her belly. Her gaze was fixed on the dark, fleeting landscape outside her window, the skeletal silhouettes of yucca and sagebrush flying past. He knew she was not just watching the scenery. She was mapping it, assessing it, searching for a landmark, an opportunity, a path to escape. To her, he was just the newest warden, the ranch, just the next cell. Elias's own thoughts were a chaotic storm. The adrenaline of the confrontation had faded, leaving behind the deep, resonant ache in his bones and a hollow pit of doubt in his stomach. What had he done? He, a man who could barely muster the strength to get through his own days, had just taken on the profound responsibility of another human life, and the one growing inside her. He looked at his own trembling hands on the steering wheel. They were the hands of a farmer, a husband, a man who had built and lost. Now what were they? The hands of a savior? Or the hands of a fool who had just spent his last dollar on a gesture of defiance that would likely kill him faster than the cancer? The irony was so thick he could taste it. He had craved a quiet, dignified end, and instead, he had invited chaos and complication to sit in his passenger seat. A memory, unbidden, surfaced from the depths of his grief. Martha, in the final weeks, her body frail but her spirit still luminous. He'd been clumsy in his care for her, his big, rough hands unused to such delicate work. He'd spilled soup on her bedsheets, fumbled with her medication. He remembered the frustration, the feeling of utter inadequacy, of wanting so desperately to soothe a pain he could not touch. He was feeling it again now, that same sense of being fundamentally ill-equipped for the task at hand. He glanced at the girl. She had not moved, had not made a sound. She was a statue of stoicism. But he saw the slight tremor in her clasped hands, the rapid, shallow rhythm of her breathing. She was terrified. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the silence. "There's a blanket behind the seat," he said, his voice raspy. "It gets cold." She didn't respond or turn her head, but after a long moment she reached back with one hand, her movements slow and cautious, and pulled the worn woolen blanket over her lap. It wasn't a truce. It wasn't acceptance. It was a small, pragmatic act of survival, and for now, it was enough. The headlights of the truck cut a solitary path through the oppressive darkness, carrying two broken people toward a broken-down home, the future a vast, unwritten, and terrifying unknown. The ranch, when they arrived, seemed to have absorbed the darkness of the night, its weathered wood and sagging porch looking more like a skeleton than a home. The wind whispered through the eaves, a mournful, lonely sound. Elias led Lena into the house, the familiar scent of old wood, dust, and lingering memories greeting them at the door. The space felt different with her in it, her presence highlighting the emptiness, the years of accumulated silence. He showed her to a room at the back of the house, Martha's room. He hadn't been inside it for more than a few minutes at a time since she'd passed, the pain of her absence too acute. Now, seeing it through the girl's wary eyes, it was just a room. A simple bed with a handmade quilt, a wooden dresser, a window looking out onto the barren fields. He left her there, closing the door softly behind him, giving her a space that was hers alone. He heated up some leftover stew, the simple task a welcome anchor in the sea of uncertainty. He set a bowl on the kitchen table for her and retreated to his worn armchair, giving her the illusion of privacy. She emerged after a long while, moving with the quiet, cautious grace of a wild thing, and ate the stew without a word, her eyes darting around the room, assessing every shadow, every sound. The days that followed unfolded in a similar rhythm of shared silence. Elias would rise at dawn, his body a map of aches and pains, and go about the pointless, necessary chores of the ranch. He'd mend a fence that held nothing in, clear brush from a field he would never plant, his movements slow and deliberate, a ritual of defiance against his own decay. Lena would watch him from the porch or the kitchen window. She never offered to help, and he never asked her to. Their communication was a fragile, unspoken language of distance and observation. He was giving her space. She was taking his measure. Then one morning, he came outside to find that a small section of the overgrown vegetable garden, Martha's old pride and joy, had been cleared of weeds. A few struggling tomato plants, long neglected, had been carefully watered and staked. He said nothing. The next day, a loose board on the porch steps had been nailed back into place. A few days after that, he found a basket of sun-warmed eggs on the kitchen counter, gathered from the handful of hens he'd kept. She was not working for him. She was contributing to the space, claiming a small piece of it as her own, building a nest. A slow, tentative trust began to germinate in the barren soil of their shared existence. It was not a bond forged from conversation or shared history, but from the quiet, steady rhythm of mutual survival. He saw her one afternoon standing by the fence line, her hand resting on her stomach, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. For the first time, the stony mask on her face had softened, replaced by a look of deep, quiet contemplation. He was an old, dying tree, and she was a seed, unexpectedly planted in his shadow, beginning to push its way toward the sun. The ranch was still a place of endings, but for the first time in a long, long time, Elias felt the faint, unfamiliar stirring of a new beginning. It wasn't his beginning, he knew that. It belonged to her, and to the child she carried. But he was, for now, its unlikely guardian. The fragile piece they had cultivated was as delicate as a desert bloom, and just as easily crushed. It was a Tuesday, the sky a brilliant, unforgiving blue, when the familiar sound of a rattling pickup truck engine broke the afternoon's tranquility. It wasn't the sound of a neighbor or the mail carrier. It was a sound Elias's body recognized before his mind did, a low, menacing growl that sent a jolt of cold dread through his veins. He looked up from the harness he was mending and saw the mud-splattered truck coming down his long driveway, kicking up a plume of angry dust. It was them, the two men who had sold him a life and now, it seemed, had come back with a case of buyer's remorse. They were the outside world, a manifestation of the casual cruelty he had tried to shut out, and they had found his sanctuary. Lena was inside, he knew, baking bread. He had smelled it just moments before, a warm, hopeful scent that was now being choked out by the smell of exhaust fumes and imminent violence. He saw her face appear in the kitchen window, just for a second, her eyes wide with a familiar, rekindled terror before she vanished back into the shadows of the house. He dropped the harness and stood up slowly, his body screaming in protest. He stood in the middle of the yard, his feet planted firmly in the dust, and waited. He would be the first thing they saw. He would be the wall they had to get through. The truck skidded to a stop just feet from him, and the two men got out, their movements full of a swaggering, predatory confidence. They looked different here, on his land, more brazen. They surveyed the decaying ranch with open contempt. "Well, look at this," the younger one said, a cruel smirk on his face. "Playing house, are we, old man?" The older one, his eyes like chips of granite, spat on the ground. "We got to thinking," he said, his voice a low growl. "That deal we made, it wasn't a fair one. You took advantage of our good nature." The lie was so audacious it was almost laughable. They weren't here because they felt cheated. They were here because they were bullies who had discovered their victim was weaker than they thought. They had likely heard whispers in town about how sick he really was, saw him as an easy mark for a second score. Maybe they wanted more money. Maybe they wanted the girl back to sell to someone else. It didn't matter. Their reasons were rooted in the same simple, ugly soil: greed. "The deal is done," Elias said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You took the money. Now get off my land." The younger man laughed and took a step closer. "Your land doesn't look like it'll be yours for much longer. We just want to talk to the girl, see how she's settling in." They were testing him, prodding him, enjoying the power they held over this frail, dying man. They represented a world without honor, a world where contracts were meaningless and strength was the only law. And in that moment, Elias knew that this confrontation was inevitable. It was the bill for his one good deed coming due. The fragile hope that had started to grow in the cracks of his broken life was about to be trampled under the boots of these two empty men. He didn't move. He just stood there, a scarecrow with a spine of steel, the last line of defense for the life he had bought, and the future she carried inside her. This was not a fight he could win with his fists. His strength was a memory, a ghost of the man he used to be. The men advanced slowly, circling him like coyotes cornering a weakened buck. His body was a traitor, a vessel of pain and exhaustion, but his will, the part of him that had made the decision at that desolate crossroads, was a shard of unbendable steel. He was no longer the man who had watched from the sidelines. The act of buying Lena, as sordid as it felt, had fundamentally changed him. It had given his ending a purpose beyond mere existence. He was not fighting for his own life. He had already relinquished that. He was fighting for hers. "There's nothing to talk about," Elias said, his voice calm, betraying none of the frantic calculations happening in his mind. He was a rancher. He knew this land better than he knew himself. He knew its secrets, its traps, its temperament. The younger man lunged, grabbing for the front of Elias's shirt. But Elias was already moving, not with speed, but with the economy of an old man who can't afford a wasted motion. He sidestepped, letting the man's momentum carry him past, and brought his heavy work boot down hard on the man's instep. There was a satisfying crunch and a howl of pain. It was a small victory, but it bought him a second. The older man, enraged, charged at him. Elias stumbled backward, his breath catching in his throat. This was it. But then, a movement from the corner of his eye. The screen door of the house flew open. It was Lena. She was not hiding. She was not cowering. She stood on the porch, her face set like stone, and in her hand she held Elias's old, heavy cast-iron skillet, gripping it like a weapon. Her eyes were blazing with a fire he had never seen before, a fierce, protective inferno. She did not look at the men. She looked at Elias, and in that one look, 1,000 unspoken words were exchanged. She was no longer a victim being passed between owners. She was a partner. She was standing her ground, on her land. The sight of her, so fierce and so pregnant, a guardian of the future, gave Elias a surge of strength he didn't know he possessed. The two men were momentarily stunned, their attention divided. They had come for an easy target and found a fortress. "Get back in the house," Elias rasped, not to her but for the benefit of the men. It was a feint. He saw the older man's eyes flicker toward her, a fatal moment of distraction. Elias seized it. He grabbed a heavy wooden rake leaning against the porch and swung it low and hard, catching the man behind the knees. He went down with a grunt, tangled and surprised. The fight was clumsy, ugly, and desperate. It was the desperate struggle of life against the void. Elias stood over the two men, his chest heaving, the rake held like a quarterstaff. He was a pathetic, terrifying figure, a dying king defending his derelict castle. The men, one with a broken foot, the other winded and humiliated, looked up at him, and for the first time they saw not a frail old man, but something elemental and frightening, a man with absolutely nothing left to lose. They had come expecting to find fear. Instead, they found a love and a sacrifice so far beyond their transactional world that they could not comprehend it, and it terrified them. The two men scrambled to their feet, their bravado shattered, replaced by a sullen, venomous fear. They cast one last look at the unholy trinity before them, the dying rancher, the pregnant warrior, and the profound, unassailable fortress of their shared will. Without another word, they hobbled back to their truck, climbed in and sped away, leaving a trail of dust and defeat that was far more satisfying than the one they had arrived with. The sound of their engine faded, and silence, a new kind of silence, reclaimed the land. It was not the empty, lonely silence of before. It was a silence filled with the echoes of victory, the resonant hum of a battle won. Elias let the rake fall from his hands, the wood clattering on the dry earth. The unnatural strength that had flooded his veins drained away as quickly as it had come, leaving him overwhelmingly, profoundly weary. He leaned against a porch post, his legs trembling, his breath coming in ragged, painful gasps. This, he knew, was the last fight. He had spent the final reserves of his life force on this one. Crucial act. Lena came down the steps slowly, the iron skillet still in her hand. She stopped in front of him, her dark eyes searching his face. The fear was gone from her expression, replaced by something deep and complex, a mixture of gratitude, concern, and a shared, hard-won understanding. He had not saved her. They had saved each other. "Are you all right?" she asked. Her voice, the first full sentence he had ever heard her speak to him, was low and clear. He managed a weak smile, a crack in the rugged landscape of his face. "Never better," he rasped, and the truth of it surprised him. He pushed himself off the post and walked shuffling into the house. He went to the old wooden desk in the corner of the living room, the one where he kept his important papers. He retrieved a folded, worn document, the deed to the ranch. He came back out onto the porch and held it out to her. She looked at the paper, then at him, her brow furrowed in confusion. "It's yours," he said, his voice soft but firm. "The land, the house, it's all I have left to give." He wasn't just giving her a piece of property, a broken-down ranch under a merciless sky. He was giving her what had been stolen from her people for generations, a place to stand, a piece of the earth to call her own, a home. He was giving her a future, not as a gift, but as a debt repaid. She took the deed, her fingers brushing his. Her hand was warm. He looked past her, at the land stretching out before them. The setting sun was painting the clouds in hues of orange and deep purple. It was the same land he had seen as a symbol of his own decay, but now it looked different. It looked like a promise. His death was no longer a surrender to the darkness. It was a release, a final, meaningful exhalation. He had planted a seed in the dust, and it was going to grow. The last cycle of his life was complete, not in lonely silence, but in this profound, sacred act of continuation.